In February 1970, a Pacific storm tore into the coastal bluffs at Cape Alava, on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state, and the sea took a bite out of the hillside above the beach. When the water pulled back, the bank had slumped away in a raw, wet scar, and sticking out of the exposed clay were things that had no business surviving: cedar planks, coiled basketry, a carved paddle, wooden boxes still holding their shape. Wood rots. Fiber rots. In most of the world, 4 or 5 centuries in wet ground leaves behind stone tools and stains in the soil, nothing more. Here, the clay had done something else. It had sealed these objects away from the air and the bacteria that break organic material down, so completely that when the storm finally let go of them, they looked less like an archaeological find than like someone had simply walked away and left the door open. This stretch of coastline sits within the traditional territory of the Makah tribe, on the westernmost edge of the contiguous United States. The place is called Ozette. What the storm had uncovered was not, as looser retellings sometimes suggest, a hidden civilization or a vanished people nobody remembered. It was something more specific, and in its way more interesting, part of a well-documented village, one whose name, location, and community had never actually been lost, buried by a landslide that Makah oral tradition had been describing for generations, at a site archaeologists had already flagged as significant more than 20 years before that storm ever hit. The real question waiting inside the clay bank was not where this place was. It was how much of it had survived intact, how old it really was, and what it would take to bring it out without destroying it in the process. The first problem in early 1970 had nothing to do with archaeology. People were walking off with what the storm had exposed. Word spread that wooden artifacts were lying loose in an eroded bank on a remote stretch of coast, and visitors began carrying pieces away as souvenirs. A local schoolteacher called the Makah Tribal Council more than once to report it, and Tribal Chairman Ed Claplin, who eventually sat down with him to hear the details. What he heard convinced him to act immediately. Within days, the council had reached Richard Doherty, an archaeologist at Washington State University who had worked at the site before, and asked him to organize an excavation before the rest of what remained was lost to the tide, the weather, or careless hands. That urgency matters, because it undercuts a common assumption about places like this one. Ozette was never a secret. An 1889 coastal survey describes it as a village of more than 20 houses. A Japanese account from decades earlier put the number at 16. Families lived there year-round into the early 20th century, moving to Ni Bay only in the 1920s, largely so their children could attend school, with the site still used seasonally for a few more years before it was finally left empty. It had been one of 5 principal villages of the Makah Nation at the time Europeans first reached the Pacific Northwest, set on a stretch of coast where migrating fur seals and gray whales passed close enough to hunt from shore-launched canoes. None of that was in question in 1970, and none of it needed rediscovering. What the storm had exposed was something older, houses from an earlier phase of that same, well-known village, sealed beneath a landslide long before any of the houses still standing in living memory were built. The mystery was never where Ozette was. It was what had happened to part of it, and how long ago. To understand why a research team would drop everything for one eroding bank, it helps to understand what Ozette represented to the people who lived there. The Makah are a New Channel-speaking people whose territory occupies the northwestern tip of the Olympic Peninsula, where the Strait of Juan de Fuca meets the open Pacific. There are 5 historic villages: Ni Bay, Bahida, Soyes, Watch, and Ozette, sat along some of the most exposed coastline in North America, and their economy was built around a skill few neighboring peoples practiced at the same scale. Hunting whales from cedar dugout canoes with hand-thrown harpoons tipped in mussel shell or bone. Archaeological evidence indicates whale hunting had been practiced there for at least 1,500 years, and whale products, meat, oil, bone, and baleen, supplied most of what Makah households ate and used. A successful hunt was a communal event with its own social order, the harpooner and his crew trained through months of physical and spiritual preparation. Whaling families held recognized status within the village, and the meat, oil, and materials from a single whale could support a community for an extended stretch of the year. Status within Makah society was not fixed at birth. Families were ranked by their relationship to a village chief, but a person in a lower-ranked household could improve their standing by marrying into a higher one, and whaling itself was one of the clearest paths to prestige a family could pursue. That mattered for how a village like Ozette was organized day to day. A longhouse was rarely one nuclear family living in isolation, but several related households sharing a single large structure, pooling labor for the hunt and dividing the results according to custom. Ozette held a particular place inside that economy. It faced open ocean along a migration corridor used by fur seals and gray whales, which made it the most productive sea mammal hunting village on the Washington coast. Every spring, families from the other 4 villages moved in to join the hunt, swelling a year-round population that lived in cedar plank longhouses up to 70 feet long and 35 feet wide, some of them shared by several related families at once. When the United States government negotiated the Treaty of Knee Bay in January 1855, Makah leaders insisted on a specific clause, securing their right to hunt whales and seals at their usual grounds, a provision most neighboring treaties of that era did not bother to include, because whaling at this scale simply was not something most other coastal peoples did. Ozette was not a footnote to that culture. For most of its history, it was one of the places that culture was built around. Richard Doherty first saw Ozette in 1947, as a young researcher conducting a survey of archaeological sites along the Washington coast. He noted a deep, undisturbed shell midden, the accumulated debris of a very long occupation, and moved on. Nearly 20 years passed before he returned. In 1966, with funding from the National Science Foundation and a team that included geologist Roald Frixell and zoologist Carl Gustafsson, Doherty opened a test trench roughly 200 feet up the slope from the beach. The trench told 2 stories stacked on top of each other. Near the surface lay the debris of the historic village, broken dishes, rusted iron, the ordinary discard of a community trading with the outside world. Well below that, sealed beneath a thick, sterile layer of clay, the team found something else entirely intact. Planks, tools, and cordage, radiocarbon dated to roughly 500 years earlier than the layer above them. That was the first confirmation that a landslide, not gradual abandonment, had buried an earlier phase of the village, and that whatever lay under the clay had been preserved rather than destroyed. Work stopped after the 1967 field season for lack of funding and might have stayed stopped indefinitely. Then came the storm of February 1970, the reports of looting, the tribal council's call, and a joint decision by the Makah Tribal Council and Doherty's team to mount a full excavation without delay. What had begun as a 2-season survey was about to become one of the largest, longest-running archaeological projects ever undertaken in North America. Turning that decision into 11 years of fieldwork meant building an entire operation from scratch in one of the most isolated corners of the country, reachable only by boat or a 4-mile hike from the nearest road. A field camp went up within weeks of the storm and grew steadily. Over the following seasons, a water system, a generator supplying round-the-clock power, a dining hall that fed as many as 55 people during the busiest summer sessions, and sleeping quarters for a rotating crew of Washington State University students and Makah tribal members working side by side, getting people and equipment in, and getting fragile artifacts out to a conservation laboratory the project had set up in Knee Bay, required help beyond what any research budget could normally arrange. A Washington senator intervened to secure military helicopters for supply runs, turning a remote beach into a functioning research station almost overnight. The excavation itself demanded techniques nobody had fully worked out in advance. Standard trowels and brushes would have torn through waterlogged with the consistency of wet cardboard, so the crew adopted pressurized hoses instead, washing away the surrounding clay in thin layers and floating the mud clear while leaving fragile objects in place long enough to record and lift them intact. It was slow, deliberate work, repeated day after day for 11 field seasons, and it is the reason Ozette produced not a scattering of durable stone tools but entire households worth of material that should never have survived at all. That level of sustained commitment, a purpose-built research camp, military helicopters, 11 uninterrupted years of excavation, tells you how quickly this storm-damaged bank was recognized as one of the most important archaeological sites in North America. If you're drawn to documentaries built from primary records rather than speculation, consider subscribing. It helps this channel keep researching stories like this one properly. Once objects were lifted from the clay, a second race began. Exposed to air, waterlogged wood starts to shrink, crack, and warp within hours, so most recovered pieces were soaked in a polyethylene glycol solution, a wax-like compound that slowly replaces the water inside wood fibers and holds their shape as they dry. Objects saturated with whale or seal oil needed an entirely different process, involving acetone and resin, and the techniques developed at Ozette drew enough international attention that archaeologists from several countries organized a conference specifically to discuss preserving waterlogged sites, using this excavation as the central case study. What came out of the clay was not a handful of scattered tools but entire households, frozen mid-use. Excavators found wooden bowls still stacked for storage, harpoon shafts left in progress, comb blanks with the teeth outlined but not yet cut through, a wooden box patched with a scrap of wood sewn over a hole. More than 3,400 whale bones turned up across the site, some still holding embedded harpoon blades, physical confirmation of a hunting economy otherwise known mainly through oral history. One of the best-known single objects recovered is a carved wooden model of a killer whale's dorsal fin, inlaid with more than 700 individual sea otter teeth, almost certainly a ceremonial piece rather than an everyday tool. By the time the count was finalized, more than 55,000 catalogued artifacts had come out of 6 houses, over 1,000 woven baskets, more than 1,000 wooden wedges, hundreds of harpoon components, arrow shafts by the thousand, roughly 300 canoe paddles, more than 100 wooden bowls, and, among the more unexpected finds, several dozen iron blades fitted into traditional handles, worked into everyday tools generations before regular European contact reached this stretch of coast. Items made of wood, bark, and fiber. Material that decays within years at almost any other archaeological site in North America. Account for roughly 4 out of every 5 objects in the entire collection. Researchers who have studied those blades trace the metal most plausibly to Asian vessels that wrecked or drifted across the Pacific, a Japanese ship carrying 3 sailors ran aground near this same coastline in 1834, and in 1997 a delegation from their home city in Japan traveled to Ni Bay to honor their memory, a reminder that this coastline's isolation has always been more assumption than fact. By the time excavation wound down in 1981, researchers had identified 6 longhouses buried beneath the slide, in varying states of preservation and completeness. 2 were fully excavated, 1 was nearly complete, 2 more were partially opened, and the last was located only in the final seasons and left largely untouched. Radiocarbon dating of charcoal and wood from the slide layer placed the event at approximately 500 years before the present. Give or take a few decades, putting it somewhere in the late 1400s to the 1500s. That figure carries real, acknowledged uncertainty. 1 sample tied directly to the slide-affected houses returned a date of 440 years before present, with a margin of 90 years in either direction, while separate samples from elsewhere on the site returned much older dates, tied to earlier, unrelated layers of occupation stretching back roughly 2,000 years in total. Not every source describing Ozette uses the same number for the slide itself, and it's worth being honest about why. Some popular accounts round the event to around 1700, occasionally connecting it to a specific, well-documented earthquake from that era. Others, including the Makah tribe's own museum, describe it as 500 years before present, consistent with the original excavation's radiocarbon work. Part of the confusion is genuinely understandable. Ozette's unstable hillside did not slide only once. Geological assessments of the site describe repeated slope failures over roughly the past 1,000 years, driven by persistent groundwater seepage in that particular section of bluff, meaning more than one landslide has affected this village across its long history, at more than one date, including a separate, later slide layer dated to sometime before 1850. The best documented, most thoroughly dated event, the one that sealed the 6 longhouses associated with Ozette's collection, points most consistently to a window centuries before 1700, not to that later, more famous date. Where a claim in this account rests on radiocarbon work tied directly to the excavated houses, it follows that evidence, where a claim rests on rounding, or on conflating one slide with another, it does not. If not a single dramatic earthquake, then what caused the slide that sealed Ozette's houses? The most direct answer, and the one best supported by the site's own geology, is also the least dramatic: rain. The bluff above the village sits on a slope where groundwater collects and periodically saturates the soil until it gives way, a pattern documented at Ozette both before and after the 500-year-old event at the center of this story. Heavy, sustained Pacific coast rainfall, the kind this stretch of coastline receives most winters, is fully sufficient on its own to trigger that kind of failure. No earthquake is required to explain what happened here. That said, the earthquake hypothesis isn't baseless, and dismissing it outright would be its own kind of overreach. On the night of January 26, 1700, a subduction zone earthquake estimated between magnitude 8.7 and 9.2 ruptured roughly 600 miles of coastline from Vancouver Island to Northern California, one of the largest earthquakes this continent has produced in the past several centuries. Because the fault lies offshore and no European was present to record it, the event went undocumented for nearly 300 years, until Japanese seismologist Kenji Satake and his colleagues traced a tsunami that struck the Honshu coast on January 27, 1700, with no accompanying local earthquake, back to a Pacific Northwest source roughly 10 hours away. Oral traditions recorded among coastal peoples from Vancouver Island Down through Oregon independently describe violent, prolonged shaking from around the same era, and geologists have matched the event to drowned, ghost forests of cedar and spruce, killed within months by sudden coastal subsidence. It is a real, thoroughly documented earthquake, and a coastal landslide is exactly the kind of damage such an event could plausibly cause. The trouble, for this specific story, is fit. Ozette's own radiocarbon evidence clusters earlier than 1700, not later, and no dating specific to the Ozette slide layer has tied it conclusively to that earthquake rather than to an ordinary wet winter on an already unstable slope. The 1700 earthquake is real and well documented. Its connection to this particular landslide is not, at least, not on the evidence available today. Both things can be true at once, and keeping them separate, rather than letting the more famous event lend borrowed certainty to the less certain claim, is simply what the evidence supports. Radiocarbon dates and oral tradition are not the only lines of evidence at Ozette. A short walk down the beach from the excavation site sits a headland known today as Wedding Rocks, where more than 40 petroglyphs are pecked and carved into the seaward boulders. An orca curves across one stone. A fisher, the forest animal, appears on another. A human face stares out from a third, and one carving in particular, a pair of joined figures, is what gives the headland its name. Local tradition has long connected it to a marriage rite once practiced there. Researchers comparing the carving style at Wedding Rocks to the decorative motifs on objects recovered from the buried houses found consistent overlap between the two, evidence that the people who made the petroglyphs and the people whose households were sealed under the landslide belonged to the same continuous artistic tradition, not two unrelated populations separated by some unexplained gap. That continuity matters, because it closes off a version of this story that shows up often in looser retellings, a mysterious, vanished culture with no clear link to anyone living today. The archaeological record argues against that framing directly. So does the oral tradition itself. Makah accounts of a great slide that buried part of Ozette long ago were already established, passed down across generations, before Doherty's team ever confirmed the event. Scientifically, the excavation did not introduce this story. It corroborated one the community already held. When archaeological dating and long-standing oral tradition arrive at the same conclusion independently, that agreement carries more weight than either source would carry alone, and it describes a very different situation than a modern claim searching for ancient support after the fact. Not every detail recovered from Ozette is comfortable to include, and this account won't linger on the ones that aren't, out of respect for a story that belongs to a living community rather than a distant one. Excavators did find human remains inside two of the buried houses, evidence that at least some residents did not get out before the slide overtook their homes. Other houses on the site appear to have been unoccupied or lightly used when the slide struck, which suggests the disaster did not fall evenly across the village. Beyond that, this account will not speculate about numbers, names, or circumstances that the archaeological and oral records do not themselves establish with confidence. What is clear is that the excavation team and the Makah Tribal Council approached this whole project as a shared undertaking, not just its most sensitive findings. Makah students worked the excavation alongside university crews throughout the 11-year project. Elders visited regularly to identify objects and explain how they were used, filling gaps that soil analysis alone could never close. And when the tribal council agreed to the excavation, it did so on a specific condition, one that would shape everything that came after, every artifact recovered would remain in Makah hands, on the reservation, rather than being distributed to outside museums and universities the way archaeological collections usually are. That condition, that the collections stay with the Makah tribe rather than leave for a university or a national museum, was unusual for its time, and meeting it meant building an institution capable of professional-grade conservation without handing the objects over to one. The result. Opened in 1979 in Nibe, the Makah Cultural and Research Center, generally known today as the Makah Museum, built specifically to house, conserve, and interpret the Ozette collection on Makah land. It displays several hundred artifacts at a time from the more than 55,000 recovered, alongside full-scale replicas of a cedar longhouse and traditional canoes. And it operates alongside a tribal archive, a historic preservation office, and a language program, working to bring the Makah language back into daily use among younger tribal members. Functions that at most archaeological sites of comparable importance would sit at a university several states away rather than inside the community whose ancestors made the objects in the first place. The effect reached beyond conservation. Makah weavers and carvers have studied basketry technique, harpoon sheath construction, and decorative patterns directly from Ozette originals. Folding designs their own recent ancestors had stopped using back into contemporary work. That is a different outcome than the one most excavations produce. Ordinarily, a community learns about its own deep past secondhand, through papers and exhibits built by outside institutions long after the fact. At Ozette, the tribal council's insistence on keeping the collection home meant the people whose history it was kept shaping how that history was studied, displayed, and used, not only at the moment of excavation, but continuously, in the decades since. So what does the evidence from Ozette actually establish, and what does it leave open? Firmly established that a landslide, driven by ordinary and well-documented geological conditions, rather than by any single catastrophic event, buried at least 6 longhouses at Ozette roughly 500 years ago, that the resulting anaerobic clay preserved an unusually complete record of pre-contact northwest coast material culture, more than 55,000 objects. Across 11 years of excavation, that Makah oral tradition describing a Great Slide predates and independently corroborates the archaeological findings, and that stylistic continuity between the buried houses and later Makah artwork rules out any notion of an unrelated, vanished population. Genuinely unresolved, the precise year of the slide, which the evidence places within a range rather than a single date, whether a seismic event contributed to it, a real possibility that current dating does not confirm, and what remains in the roughly 95% of the village site that has never been excavated at all, since the entire 11-year project examined only a small fraction of the original settlement. That last point is worth sitting with. Ozette was never a lost city waiting to be rediscovered. It was a known, continuously remembered village, one of 5 that anchored an entire nation's way of life, that happened to have part of its history sealed by an ordinary disaster and returned centuries later, through a combination of careful science and a community's insistence on remaining the author of its own story. The storm that opened that bluff in February 1970 did not uncover a mystery so much as hand one back, incomplete, to the only people with the standing and the knowledge to make real sense of it. Most of Ozette still lies unopened, exactly where the slide left it. If a future excavation reached the other 95% of the site, using techniques the 1970 team never had access to, what do you think it's more likely to do? Confirm the picture already assembled from the 6